This is The Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Ayoub.
Okay, hello. Thanks for having me on your show. I really enjoy your pod, and it's an honor to be here.
Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Carla Joy Bergman. I use she, they pronouns, and I am calling in from, well, I guess so-called Canada in the Pacific Northwest, Vancouver on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. I'm, I guess, a writer and storyteller and mom and podcaster. Yeah, kind of multimedia artist, I would say. I like to collaborate and work with folks and amplify voices that are less heard or deliberately silenced, and using technology and various mediums to do that work, from print to film, everything in between. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Carla, thanks a lot for joining us, or joining me and listeners, so us. We will be primarily talking about this book that you edited and you also wrote in, called Trust Kids, Stories of Youth Autonomy and Confronting Adult Supremacy, which came out with the AK Press a few months ago, I think. I don't remember when I got this. I think it was a few months ago.
November 1st, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Talk to us a bit about this book, kind of like the genesis behind it, maybe some of the contributors, or at least how it kind of came about. And I suppose the general question to sort of anchor this conversation is what is youth autonomy and why does it matter, basically?
Wow, that's a big question. Okay, so I'll start maybe with the book and then go into the topics in the book. So it goes back to my own childhood and being frustrated with relationships that are hierarchical and non-consensual and unfair. So I can't really pinpoint a moment when this became like a hot topic for me and I wanted to talk about it, but it really took flight when I became a parent, because someone who was pushing for and often demanded horizontal relationships. Even when I was in college, I just wouldn't buy into the hierarchy in the classroom. And luckily, most of my instructors and professors, I think, really found it refreshing, and I ended up building solid relationships with them. So it's just something that's been orbiting around, but it doesn't really get tested until you're a parent, I would say, or until you're in a living situation with someone who's really young. Because all of a sudden you have this tremendous amount of power, and trust is coming at you really easily, and you can manipulate it and use it in all kinds of ways to wield things to go your way. And so being challenged about my adult supremacy every single day, and failing constantly, was just where it really started to become more of a topic in my mind or in my heart or something. It just began to bloom. My oldest is neurodifferent, definitely on the autism spectrum. So school was just a disaster for him. And that's when the intersection kind of schooling and anti-authoritarian or anti-hierarchical relationships started to really come together, coalesce. So I, about 21, 22 years ago, we started being part of a democratic school where these conversations and topics were what orbited around the project. And then I started participating in a youth-run arts and activism space called Purple Thistle. Actually, my son went first at age 11, and I slowly followed. And there's where it really started to take hold for me, because it was about solidarity, and it was about working with kids in the neighborhood who had to go to school and carving out a place and a space that could be theirs, that they could hang out and do cool stuff and connect with other struggles in the community for free. And it was after school, and just a tremendously brilliant project that was founded by Matt Hearn and Six Youth in 2001. I just had these things running around all the time. And one of the things that I was really, what I'm getting to why I did this book, was there's two pieces. One is the conversation around youth liberation, which is quite different than autonomy, which I'll get to in a second, was really marginalized. It constantly was, the kind of narrative around organizers and radicals was that, only privileged kids could do it. It was really confined to school and school resistance. So I started using the phrase solidarity begins at home at that point to kind of try to deepen the conversation to like adult supremacy is everywhere all the time. It's in every single room, always. And it was sort of at that juncture when I started thinking about adult supremacy as the systemic problem that it really gelled for me. Youth liberation, what happens is it kind of silos it down into an individual group who is facing some structural oppression, and they need to get free from it. And there's this thing that happens with young people, they grow out of it. They literally age out of it, and they become part of the domineering group, adults. So where's the intersection there? Where can we really grapple with this? And to me, it was like confronting adult supremacy and then working towards youth autonomy in the everyday with the young people in your lives. And autonomy just means, without they have their self. They get to decide how they live, where they live, how they, varying pieces there, because a 3-year-old can't choose probably where the family's going to live because, capitalism and all kinds of things. That's too much pressure to put on a young person. But like autonomy for themselves. And to me, that includes consent in a deep way, and around food, around body autonomy, school, even all those types of things. And I think it's just a place where adults can be in solidarity with young people and work on confronting because it's like actually up to us to do the work. And then, all work together for collective liberation, because that obviously is the goal.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. I mean,
that's the kind of background. Sorry, I didn't really get into the book or the
No, that's
people
okay. It's kind of the follow-up question anyway, because at the beginning of the book you say, or you write, like you said in the introduction, like that part of it is like how we can create more as in italic, autonomous communities through deepening our relationships with children. And then you create that with like kind of creating long-lasting change by co-creating a future that is local, decolonial, and autonomous, all amid the ongoing discussion of capitalism. End quote. And the writers themselves, I don't remember off the top of my head, but quite a few of them are themselves like underage, like as in under 18, quote unquote. Can what was that process like? And maybe you can focus on those specific chapters if you want.
Sure.
Talk to us about them.
Yeah. So my work has always been about including young people in a non-tokenistic way, in a really genuine way around relationships. It has to be a web of relationships. I didn't just seek out, who's the young people who are writing today or, thinking today about this topic. So it's all very relational, either directly to me or webs of, through other friends in the book. And it just, to me, it just felt like, just to really drive it home that this is an adult issue at the end of the day in terms of confronting adult supremacy. So that's why it's mostly adults in the book. And this book is primarily for adults. So it's why, because I've had people say, why isn't it filled with young people only? And it's like, well, because we need to do this work. And then there's, I try to approach things in a really deeply, profoundly intersectional way in terms of like our axes of oppressions. And trans issues, and particularly in the US, are really just really intersecting with a type of fascism that's brutal. And so it was important to me to include some young trans voices in particular around this, because it's a big issue. And I started the book off kind of from those personal stories, and a couple of them are parents who are talking about this issue. One is in a Danny Bertison's in a conversation with their trans child, and that's really nice. And just being what does it look like? Like, I love the opening essay from Nolika Radway, because she our work really intersects because she ran a free school as well, and did a lot of. She's really been in this conversation a long time, and so to have her talk about where she was still hitting hard edges around this issue of kids becoming their full selves at a young age, and identifying as queer and trans and whatnot. And I think her piece shows a level of vulnerability that was really important to open up the book. And then I think like the third or fourth piece is from my youngest, Uliam. And he and I do a podcast together called Grounded Futures. And we just have had I've just learned a lot about him, about really, really facing my adult supremacy in the everyday, especially around power and how I wield it and use it, and in such deep, subtle ways I use it. And he's just so kind, and we're in such deep friendship around it. So I'm able to learn a lot. And his piece just felt vital. Like it had to be in the book because he just thinks about things and does things in a way that I wouldn't do. Or yeah, and there's Kitty Lou, well, in the book it's Kitty Sipple, but Kitty Lou Bear had a young person in their life, and they have a conversation in the book as well. And yeah, thanks for asking. But yeah, that's...
No, that's amazing. I mean, honestly, while reading, especially those like those particular chapters, I couldn't help but like, I don't know what's the term for it, but like wonder like why wasn't that present when I was, that age, roughly that age. I'm 31, so I still have pretty good-ish memories of my teenage years, child, like under that, bit less. But I do remember one of my earliest memories, and I wanted to kind of bring it up as an anecdote. I was going to this private Catholic school for most of my teenage years, and it was pretty, I mean, as it sounds, pretty conservative, pretty... I mean, it is what it is. I did have some nice teachers here and there, but overall, I would describe the experience as like broadly negative. And at the age of, I think it was around 10 or 11, I'm not entirely sure, maybe 9, there was I mean, I don't know what else to call it other like immoral panic, a satanic panic even, like immoral panic around, the Satanists are coming or whatever.
Yes, yeah.
And this was a global thing, I later learned.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this was in the late 90s, early 2000s in my case, and it was in Lebanon. But as I said, I later learned that it was pretty much a global thing, and I just remember now. Obviously, I was like scared. I was like 9, 10, as I said, pretty religious at the time, and I was kind of told to wear a crucifix everywhere in case Satanists come to kidnap me or whatever. And none of that happened. There were no Satanists anywhere around. And what's kind of funny is that they and I remember this clearly because it was a few years before the whole Da Vinci Code and stuff like that. And so they mixed all of that stuff together with like goths and kids who listen to Metallica and people who have read the Da Vinci Code, basically all of the above kind of thing. And I just remember just never being actually talked to, like no one actually asking me my opinion. Like I had lots of feelings from what I can remember that, probably very confusing feelings. But like basically asking myself, like, what is this? Why is it happening? What can we do about it? Actually relatively complicated questions, I would say, but no one bothered, of the adults, I mean, no one actually bothered to ask. And in fact, the irony is that so many of the kids later on would be listening to, for example, to Metallica. Like it was a popular band at the time. And that just showed that they adults had very little to no idea of what was actually going on in our lives. They had no idea what we were listening to, what we were talking about most of the time. We had a role, right? Like we had a persona that we had for the most part around them. And then we had a persona that we had around each other, to various extent. And so I just remember about that. And the irony, as I said, is that I later ended up listening to Metallica and actually being quite okay with Satanists because I Googled them at one point. Like I didn't really, that fear wasn't there after I had the tools. It was in the early days of the internet in our case. I had sort of have the tools to sort of look things up and whatnot. But anyway, yeah. So I thought a lot about that. And while reading this book as well, I I knew when I was around 13 to 14, I think around 14, that school wasn't for me. Like I was just unhappy there. I was
Mm-hmm.
not actually learning much at one point. And here I'm currently finishing a PhD, so like I've gone through the route of going through academia and education. So like by any standard, I've quote unquote done it well.
Mm-hmm.
But I honestly think I would have done it even better had I been allowed to leave school earlier and do something else, and then maybe apply to college later on or whatever. So all of this to say, like I don't know. I guess I really like the book, is what I'm saying, and I like the fact that it's also not linear in the sense that one chapter kind of the chapters are kind of independent from one another, and they embody so many different experiences that I was able to relate to aspects of it, even though like the contexts were different and whatnot. But yeah, anyway, I like the book.
I love that. I love that story. I'm sorry you didn't get context around
Hmm.
that fear. Yeah, it was really big. I wasn't when that was going on. My youngest was really young, and I had already experienced some of that in the early. Like it comes up constantly. It was a big thing in the early '80s as well.
Hmm.
And uh, like Judas Priest and those bands were like the culprits. But yeah, I'm glad that you
Yeah.
found.
I mean, so one of the reasons I brought it up is that one of the through lines in a lot of these panics, moral panics, and usually intersected with conspiracy theories, is this idea that kids have to be quote unquote protected, and also as importantly as that, they are very rarely actually talked to. Like they're not asked their opinions, they're not asked how they feel. It's really like it's typically the way I picture it is so-called parents groups, expressing concerns and then going to some kind of town hall or voting in a certain way or talking about it on a Facebook group these days or whatever, and kind of coming together and say like, our children are being brainwashed by these days in the US. I know it's like critical race theory or whatever, and I
Mm-hmm,
know that
mm-hmm,
there's like it's cool because I'm quite obsessed with I'm autistic, so I go through obsessive stuff, and I'm quite obsessed with like conspiracy theories and how they function and why they exist, and because they just say a lot,
mm-hmm,
they just tell us a lot about what's happening, and like from the witch trials to the satanic panic to QAnon to the Red Scare to I don't know, pretty much I don't know, I wrote some other stuff. Yeah, obviously even aspects of white supremacist violence. So many of these phenomena often, not always, but often take for granted the fact that children cannot be talked to, have basically no opinion of their own, and if they do have an opinion, it's de facto wrong, and that's it. And the irony is that even the terms that we use, of course, like this is childish and whatnot, equals this is immature or this is like
mm-hmm,
not to be taken seriously. Even when we have situations, and here I think of like an obvious one that probably most people know about, where like the climate activists like Greta Thunberg and Vanessa Nakata and many
mm-hmm,
others who were underage when they started, were under 18 when they started, um, were being at the same time belittled because of their age, while also at the same time the largely adult crowd were acting like quote unquote like children. And there was a in a sense of like an immature way, and I'm putting this in quotation. And so
mm-hmm.
I, I don't know what you make of these recent developments, if that, because we have seen much more of a, I think maybe I'm wrong, but much more of a presence of the youth, of people who are like younger than others,
Yeah.
who have been able to at least be more present. It's something that's usually associated with Gen Zers, for example, with Gen Z's generation, to various extent. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure. I'm sure it depends on context and whatnot, but it's something that is noticeable, right? Like it's something that
Mm.
for whatever that is, wherever that leads, I have no idea, but it's definitely something that's noticeable. And I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, I have lots of thoughts. Yeah, the first of all, like I've had people ask me why I didn't, reach out to Greta for this book because I had started working on it before the pandemic, but then I put it on hold because I didn't want it to be a pandemic um, focused book,
Sure.
and also families were struggling really intensely, and so I
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
paused it for a year. Um, Young people are always allowed to be activists, and they're always allowed to be tokenized and have their little group and have the youth panel, the youth group. That's always been a
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's quite white to say that it's new.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, in terms of the context of North America, because we know that kids, young people in more marginalized communities, and where, like, where life is really, really challenging and hard. They always organized and were always part of the struggle, and it was always multi-generational and intergenerational rather than a tokenized, pushed over to the, like a, I don't, I have nothing against Greta or that, but I don't like what the movement has done with her and how they use her. I think it is not youth autonomy. It has nothing to do with liberation. And in fact, it was Uliam why we did our podcast, because when that was all going on, he was really frustrated. He was like, and it got siloed down to school and school actions. Yes. And as an unschooler, he was like, it's so controlling and so contrived. And for him, he's like, I want to have conversations about what are we building? What are we creating? What are we doing about climate change? I don't want to just go stand and protest. Like, that feels like that we're just getting caught into the professional mode of movement building instead of actually doing something. So we, started our project and started having conversations with organizers and people doing cool stuff about this issue. Yeah, so I just really like to point out that isn't what I'm getting at. That doesn't actually confront adult supremacy at all. I mean, maybe there's glimmers of it because people are listening to a 17-year-old, but there's always been charismatic leaders across ages. Just like when most movement leaders were white cis men, there was always that token woman, or that, the one black woman, or what I mean? Like, it's always been part of the left and the rhetoric. And it concerns me, actually, because it makes people go, oh, well, everything's fine. It's kind of like when Biden, the joke in the US when Biden got in, like liberals literally had signs that said, now I can go back to having brunch. It's kind of like that. Like, oh my gosh. It's not even close to being dealt with.
No, absolutely. And yeah, thanks a lot for that clarification as well, because it is when I say, like, it's noticeable, as in quite literally, I've just seen it being talked about more and more. Wherever that leads, it's obviously still very much of an open question, and as you, I think, pointed out very well, like, there are lots of reasons to also be skeptical. It also usually, and just to use that as an example, because again, she's like a famous example here, but it usually also lets the adults in that situation basically off the hook, because they are the ones, as you said, who are like, yes, oh, well, at least we're platforming her, at least we're inviting her and others, at least we're having the, we saw this in the recent COP in Cairo, which was particularly egregious, I think, which allowing like very little space, while like Egyptians obviously are not allowed to do anything because it's a dictatorship. This is kind of a bit of a tangent, possibly, but I was thinking of like, what is the relationship between, and this is very much an open question, you don't necessarily have to have an answer for this specifically, but there is a parallel in a bizarre or interesting, I'm not sure which term to use, way between how young people are talked to and how old people are talked about, and how old people are talked about. And by old people, I mean like the elderly, right? Like people who are put in that category. And I'm actually, I'm reminded of a sketch. It was part of one of the episodes of Seinfeld, because I recently did an episode on Seinfeld. And in that sketch, the kind of the joke, the kind of the punchline, if you want, is that when you're a kid, birthdays don't matter, and when you're an elder, of a certain age, birthdays also don't matter. And the kind of the joke was that, well, the adults around you are treating you like a kid, right? Like, are treating you like they're changing your diapers, that sort of thing. And not entirely, because I'm not a big fan of the guy, but I'm not entirely sure he meant it in a critical way. I think he was just kind of mocking old people and mocking kids. But there is arguably an interesting argument to be made here, that there is something interesting that is happening, how there is a kind of literally you can think of a timeline, and from a certain age to a certain age, we are more or less taken seriously, or can be taken more seriously, but anything before that and after that, with some obvious exceptions or some occasional exceptions, we're not. And this is what I think, like we say that we're infantilizing the elderly, right? Like we're actually using that term to say like we're infantilizing, we're treating them like children, which says a lot about
How we treat
what
children.
we mean. Exactly. It says how we treat children. It says about everything basically, but yeah, I don't know. This doesn't necessarily have to be a
I actually have
yeah.
a response, and I have to thank Toby Rollo, who wrote for the book, for it, because I hadn't really thought it through. It's definitely something that I would get hung up on, ageism at the other end of life. So he says no. Let's hear it. Let me explain why. Because I actually hadn't really thought this through. But
Yeah.
elders, at least in the context of most places, not everywhere, actually have rights.
Mm-hmm.
They have rights for their body. They have rights for how they're treated. And they have they're protected in a real deep way. Kids do not. It's still illegal in most, like so many states, to spank your children. It's very different, actually. I think that, but there's similarities in terms of who has, when we talk about power. I think when we can sort of pull it apart and talk about power. And there's definitely, between 30 and 70 are kind of like the prime ages where people have the most power. And that's based on all kinds of supremacy stuff around intellectual ability, money, income earning, all those types of things are kind of webbed into that power and who has it and how it's wielded. And definitely as people become elders, and I really like people, some folks have, like, I think Cleve Benelli did this, like, really, you have to earn to be an actual elder. Like, you have to show up and be well, treat young people well, and be in community in a good way, and be willing to be challenged. So let's just say the elderly. Yeah, there's definitely, and the fact that comedians and other people can, or even anybody calls it infanticizing the elder, shows you how much hatred there is for young people or for children. Like, that's probably one of the hardest things that I had to really look at working on this book and have been more vocal about. I used to, call it my feminist kind of intersection. I used to try to hold the nuance of, like, single moms or moms who are struggling or parents who are struggling. And the more I look at get close to adult supremacy and really examine it, the hatred of children is pretty deep. And it's by design. It was designed this way because colonizers know that the best way to assimilate people in one generation is to go after the children and to take away their sense of who they are, and use pedagogy as the ultimate tool to get rid of it.
It's that infamous kill the Indian, save the man that American missionaries especially were talking about at the time. No, thanks a lot for that as well. It's very interesting. Like, I'm still kind of struggling with even realizing, and this book helped me a lot to kind of reflect a bit deeper. There was always this kind of a joke or whatever, like growing up. It's almost like, for example, you're an undergrad at university, you're 17, 18. Someone who's like, I forgot what the terminologies are, like a senior or whatnot, is 18, 19, and someone who's at the last year, let's say, is 20, 21, whatever. And there's almost like there is quite literally a hierarchy there, obviously. And part of it is just, oh, you've done 2 years, you've done 3 years. But then there's also the fact that I remember very well, like when I started university, we would actually say to one another, well, next year it will be us, and in 2 years it will be us. So basically, let's just hold on for now, and then we can be the older people in that group. There's like, and because it's usually in situations where it's like every 3 years, the age brackets is like more or less 3-4 years at a time, something like that. It's very easy to then conclude that, like, and not just that, but conclude, I mean that well, you just need to wait and then you will be better off, than the person that's coming after you. And you can actually feel good about yourself then because you didn't feel good about yourself, last year. And I remember very distinctly, like, actually hating younger folks. And by younger folks, I mean anyone who was 1 year younger. Like, I'm not even saying like 10 years younger, just because I now in retrospect, I didn't think about it kind of consciously at the time. I didn't act on it as far as I can remember, or I may have done in subconscious ways in which that I'm still trying to think about. But it's almost like it's the same stuff, like, oh well, kids are pointless, like what's the point of a kid, what's the point of a child, and what I don't know, the sort of things that you feel like the stereotypical or the cliche, like older person who's kind of grumpy and complaining about those youth or whatnot. And that joke, like, through I'm not sure I'm even expressing myself well, but like I feel like it's been internalized somehow in one way or another. At least it's something that I've seen in myself and like friends, stuff like that, even in in broader culture, whether it's here in Europe or like back home in Lebanon. It's something that, yeah, there is, as you said, there is a genuine, or at least a pretty raw hatred of those that are younger in one way or another. They're often talked about as, repeating myself a bit, and in the headlines, in the articles, that you just pick up any newspaper that has something to do, or a topic on, children or on teenagers or whatnot. It's almost always, with the exception of some who are like tokenized here and there, or like, the savant, the genius, the whatever, it's almost always something is wrong with the young. Something is wrong with the
Totally.
youth. In one way or another, something is wrong with them. And then the reverse, which can be problematic as well, is like, well, the kids are all right. The kids are going to be all right. Which
They're going to save
they're
us.
going to save us, right?
Just like the worst.
Which is an amazing burden to put on people. But yeah, so I don't know if you have any reflections on that. Feel free. Otherwise, I can just go to the next question.
Yeah, no, I thank you. That's beautiful. I'm loving that we're having a dialogue, and I agree. It is internalized. I mean, that's how oppression works, right? I think why I was really pulled to working on this topic is that it's something we all experience in one way or the other. I don't mean to collapse this into sameness. This isn't a liberal call for like we're all the same. Obviously, it's very different, and the levels of which we experience youth oppression and childism. But it is something we all can kind of, I don't know, remember and talk about because it is internalized and we do carry it forward, and it is in every single room we're in. It's always present. And so I think it's a place to really come together and then move out from there. But and I agree with some of the scholars who put it at the center of all oppression, and including bell hooks, and like she saw it as that's where it all begins.
Yeah,
it all begins in the home against the oppression and the domination of the child. And she pointed to and I really love that she said parenting, the patriarchal parent. She did not distinct that it had to be a cis male. It didn't matter.
Yeah, it's a form of power regardless of who's wielding it. Yeah, I mean, so linked to that, like throughout the book, there's a quite a number of chapters that have to do with the topic of education, of like schooling versus unschooling versus non-schooling versus different ways of schooling and unschooling and so on. And as I said before, like I generally do think that had this book been around back then and folks taking it seriously and kind of been part of a wider conversation even back home in Lebanon, I do generally like a good chunk of the years that I consider to be largely negative. Like I have very, very few positive memories from like the first 2 decades, which is saying a lot because I'm like 3 decades now. So like 2/3 of that.
Yeah, that's sad, right?
It is. It's very sad, and obviously me and my wife, we have this conversation all the time, and we're like at the stage now where we're saying we're trying to reckon with everything that happened, and it stops at us, right? Like for the next generation and whatnot, we don't want to reproduce that. So there's that at least.
Yes.
But it does say a lot. Like I'm still struggling to this day, and I try to be open about these things, but I still struggle with issues of language. I love learning languages, but I struggle with them a lot due to like childhood bullying at the time. And it's not just that really. It's also like certain topics were made, or certain subjects in school were kind of made inaccessible because there was only one way of learning, and that's it. If you
Yep.
couldn't, if you were not resonating with how the teacher was teaching you math, well, that means you suck at math, and that's it. If you didn't resonate with how the teacher was teaching you philosophy, you sucked at philosophy, and that's it. I failed at philosophy at the baccalaureate, as it's called back there, because the teacher said I just didn't understand whatnot, and I got like an 8 out of 20 and whatnot. And I'm doing a PhD in philosophy now. Like
Of course.
it's so
Yeah.
and I could say, oh well, fuck you and whatnot, but it doesn't matter obviously because that's 20 years ago now, and whatnot. The problem is that this is still happening. That person or other people are still teaching
Yeah.
in this way. There's still this assumption that obviously whether it's a point system, whether it's tests, whether it's whatnot, there's some conversation around that in the UK these days. You know, it it's when again when I read a book like this one, and I've read some others to that effect, but honestly, this is one of the best. And
Aw.
it's so obvious. It feels that it should be so obvious that up until a certain age, okay, some guidance is needed here and there, and then the more we mature, the more we can be autonomous. Or I'm not sure I'm using the correct terminology, but like I think you know what I mean. And
Yeah.
I remember actually pretty distinctly, like one of the things that I really appreciate and how my dad did things at some point is that when I was 14, I decided I want to quit school and become a footballer. I had just decided there. And for like American listeners, I mean soccer. I wanted to be footballer. And what's kind of funny is that my dad said, okay, you can do that. But there are footballers who continue school, is what he said. He's like, oh, okay. And then so basically I couldn't rebel, but there wasn't a rebellion to be done. And so I actually got bored of the topic of football at some point. And so the fact that he was actually just willing to say, okay, sure, you can do that if you want, and this is how you would do it. And he actually did some research and said, like, you can join this club if you want as a start or training and whatnot. Actually gave me the impression that I could do something about it if I wanted. Now, I still think it was limited. I don't think it was entirely autonomous, all of that stuff. But I feel like even that tiny window of an opportunity was already something that I had that I genuinely think most people around me back then didn't have. And I'm talking about like my own circle of friends and that sort of thing. And so damaging my self-confidence at the time, I would say like I've mostly recovered from that. There are still kind of hiccups, if you want, from that past, but damaging that self-confidence, I genuinely feel, was at the core of that education system, was really like to tell you that basically you are not good enough, and these are the steps that you can take, that maybe if you achieve them, you can then position yourself in some kind of hierarchy, maybe at the top, maybe second, maybe third, maybe fourth, whatnot. And this is how good you are. Basically, it's how this is your self-worth. And again, it feels like it should be so obvious that this is such a moronic way of doing things. It's just such an inefficient, bad, I don't know, efficient, I'm not sure if for capitalism maybe it's efficient, I'm not sure, but like it's such a unhealthy way of doing things. And it feels like it's trying to solve a problem by creating a problem. If you see what I mean,
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
because obviously the point of schools in this system is to create productive members of societies. People can't see that I'm doing the air quotes.
Yeah.
Productive members of society, and that's it. It's not about learning. It's not about growing. It's not about gaining
No.
knowledge. Those are like, well, you can do those on your own time.
Yeah.
But like it's like a side job, right, or a hobby, rather than like something
Yeah.
that you can actually do because you want to.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that resonates with me a lot. I have learning disabilities and dyslexia and speech apraxia. And if a teacher couldn't see past that stuff, then I failed and didn't, I was one of these students who, failed, got incompletes, or got like A's. Like if the teacher could see through the learning, that barrier that I had, they saw like my penchant for being a nerd and like loving ideas and loving knowledge and loving history. But it took a really unique learning space for that to get nurtured and cultivated, and it was rare. And I'm a high school dropout and proud of it. You know, one of the things we tried to do at the Sissel, it was a bit challenging, but like, you know, high school is just, particularly for most youth, a waste of time. Like, it just really ought to be abolished, like 100%. Like, it's such a fertile time, and like if we're living in the way we're living, where that age group is still living in a house where people are supporting, financially supporting them, like, what an incredible time to really do that exploration and like do that deep, like, connecting to self. And I've seen it in both my kids. That's why I like, and not just them, like, I, you know, it gets testimonial, but like, because of the work I've been involved in the last 20 years and communities, it's countless numbers of young people who didn't do high school that are in my life, that are now in their 30s and 40s and and teens and 20s too. But and seeing how they enter their 20s is so incredibly different than like the people I was around, or most people who are schooled, because they have to do that kind of fumbling and finding themselves and figuring out their autonomous selves in their 20s instead. And there's something wonderful if that can happen in the teens, I believe. And the other piece too is that unschoolers, or kids who have a more autonomous life and a consensually based life at home, at a young age, tend to like maturation or an individuation and a maturate, it happens earlier. It just does, because they have a sense of themselves. They don't feel gaslit. They know themselves really young. And yeah, guidance happens all along the way. Like, I still reach out to my friends and including my kids, for guidance, because we should support each other, you know. But yeah, it's true. It's like, and it all works out, you know, like in the end, you can 30, 40 years later, you can be like, oh, well, I ended up here. But like, every now and again, I feel a bit sad, because I had the potential. Potential is not even the right word. It's like, I would say it was like a desire and a penchant towards being like a scholar. But it was constantly thwarted because of my learning disabilities and dyslexia and speech apraxia. So people would just belittle me and write me off because I couldn't say a word correctly, or my sentence structure would be a bit wacky. And
right. In my case, it was because I couldn't roll. I still can't roll my R's.
Right.
And it's
I can't either.
Yeah. But like in French and in English, it's sort of okay. In French, especially, it's kind of common. But in Arabic, it's pretty distinctive.
Right. Wow.
And so because of that, that was like that sort of thing. But
right. So you can relate to when I say I had a speech impediment, like how.
Yeah. Basically, as soon as I opened my mouth, it immediately I was noticeable. Basically, right. Like I wasn't able to just say a sentence for the value of that sentence, right? Like there was always something that preceded whatever the actual content is coming out of my mouth. And again, when I kind of think of those years, especially, I don't have much memories of before then. And to be honest, the early 2000s kind of sucked. But because I was 10 when 9/11 happened, and then 2003 was invasion of Iraq, and Lebanon was also affected. And it was just not fun in general. But even putting all of that aside, which is, there are bigger events that most of us can't control necessarily, at least not in the immediate terms. I just remember so many days that are kind of blurred into one another because I can't distinguish most of them, because we're sitting in class. Everything is kind of the same all the time. No creativity it's literally not allowed. Like you can't draw, you can't decorate your class in one way or another. And I know schools differ on that. Some are more flexible than others, obviously, which is good. But that was my experience. And I just remember thinking a lot of the time that I just could be doing something else right now. It was just that I want to be done so that by 3 p.m. the bus takes me home and then my day can start. That's how it felt. Like my day starts at like 3:30 p.m. roughly speaking, have a kind of a late lunch, and then start the day. And then like between, I don't know, let's say 4 p.m. and by the time you went to bed at like 9 or 10 at that age or whatever, it's like an entire world was happening. And it's the same time, more or less, as the time that was spent at school, right? Like the 8 and then 8 hours of sleep. And I guess I'm just repeating myself a bit, but it just says a lot, I think, that...
Well, it's perpetuating this thing that we have to do under capitalism.
Yep.
Like called being a worker, and
Exactly.
like generating and that you have to be okay with being bored, and your real life starts after work, and you know.
And and the hierarchy, right, between like you can enjoy things on your own time. You can, I don't know, I want to learn Japanese, fine, that's fine. You can do this after school. Or you really want to get into, I don't know, some series or some movie or some whatever, something you want to explore. You can do that, that's fine, as long as you have finished the serious stuff, because there's a hierarchy of what counts as important and not. And then maybe on your own time you can do this, which obviously for most people really, they end up, what was that Mark Twain quote of like, happy is the person who makes a living out of their hobby or something along those lines, something along those lines. And, which says a lot already, even back then. But like, it's like, we know like hobbies are associated with happy stuff, right? And we know that these are positive feelings for the most part. We know that these are things that are good for us. And at the same time, it's almost like while this knowledge that we have, or this realization that we have, is in tension with a different type of, I'm not sure if the term of knowledge, but definitely something that we have internalized that tells us that even if it's important, it's just not as important. Even if it is important, it's just not as important as the thing that counts as quote unquote productive. So my partner is really into art. She's kind of exploring. She's really getting into it. And I know that I can really see her doing this quote unquote full time. But she's learning. It's like she has to kind of learn certain skills and all of that stuff. And she's able to do it I think, to a larger extent than she would have in a different situation, because her work is flexible and whatnot. But fundamentally, if because of the world we live in and we have to think about rent and, all of that stuff, for the most part, she can't just say, well, I'm just going to quit now, my paid salary thing kind of thing, and I'm just going to dedicate myself to this thing. And maybe in a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, maybe I can make enough money out of it to sustain myself, because you have to think about it again within capitalism and all of that stuff. Even, those flexibilities, you can kind of create them in a situation within the household, if it's a place of trust, obviously, and safety and so on. But even in that situation, you have the internalized worker, right? You have the internalized productivist mindset that is difficult to get rid of. I'm not completely rid of it. I can't. I'm trying to here and there, and I have some successes, one day yes, one day no. But, sometimes I'm like chilling on the couch or in a chair or whatnot, and I was like, fuck, I need to be doing something now.
Right.
I was like, no, you don't. but I have to. Yeah.
Do you know that school, like, I don't know, I can't pull it out of the thin air, but school, like, I can't remember what the Latin word, but it's it literally means leisure. It's like hanging out and learning together, and leisure.
Lycée, you mean?
Yeah, like so.
Lyceum, yeah.
Yeah, so, and we know this, and we know that there's all kinds of problems with who got to learn together under pre-capitalism. But we also know that, like, the rise of universities, like it, like in terms of what you were saying earlier, that the hierarchy wasn't there because the teachers were the ones who were graded, really. Like, if when you, as a student, usually a man, went through, like the students owned the universities early on. Like, it was theirs. They hired it was student run. And if you didn't pass your oration at the end of your philosophy class, that professor was let go. It was all on them to show up and create the learning space and mentorship. And, it's just all gotten about supporting capitalism and warehousing young people to be good workers. And of course, there's accelerated programs and special programs for those special kids who get to be the future leaders and the future ruling class, and that's all built into the system as well. And there was a thing going around. I really don't like the narrative that kids today aren't very smart or kids today don't read, and it's all connected to schooling and marginalized and school cuts and just all kinds of poverty. There's all kinds of things going on. But it was a Harvard study about Harvard students, Gen Z, showing up and not reading books, and then you dig into it, and it's like all these really affluent kids who have been bought into Harvard, so it's like very skewed. It's a very skewed test. It's not really about young people in general and different interests. Like that's always been a thing. Not every kid loves reading, and that's okay. And that's one of the things that I really push against, like this whole like centering a certain way of being in the world and being valued as being, this is why I identify as a deep professional, because I think like this whole idea of everyone trying to become a professional is so tied in to colonialism and whiteness and empire, really. It's control over us. And so, like, yeah, some kids, they have other things to contribute to our lives, to each other's lives, to their own life. And it's not maybe sitting in a corner reading theory books,
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
it doesn't
Like
mean
that.
anything when I just really don't like those narratives. I mean, I was, I'm a Gen Xer, and like our generation, when I was coming of age, we were like the lost generation. We had a very similar narrative out about us that's going now with the the punk kids and the what were we called, latchkey kids, right? Like super neglected, like the kind of intersection of women's rights and women's being able to work more meant that kids were kind of left. That whole feminist movement really left kids behind. And so I just people, I mean, it's propaganda that does this, and it's part of the machine. But wow, it's like goldfish memories about history, like it's just
It just recycles itself
it recycles itself.
every generation or so.
A historical amnesia is that play. It's cultivated too and manufactured as well. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually currently listening to a series on Behind the Bastards, the podcast on the Illuminati, or rather like the conspiracy around that, and how that it was basically because it was like a group of people in Bavaria, and then there was this entire conspiracy around them, and basically the conspiracy is the conspiracy in the sense that the conspiracy ended up kind of taking on a life of its own, and it then gets recycled every generation more or less since then. Whether there's a satanic panic, whether there's a QAnon stuff, whether there's obviously the anti-Semitic stuff, the Jewish cabal, and shit like that.
Absolutely.
All of these things get recycled to the point that Robert Evans, who's the host of that podcast, was reading at some point one of the I forgot what it was, but reading a scholar quoting one of those Illuminati people from like the 1700s and whatnot, and the scholar's analysis of that time and of how conspiracy theories worked at that time. You could just change some vocabularies here and there, and it would just sound like the QAnon stuff. Like it's really, it's so. And it can be quite disheartening. So it's just like thinking about like how certain things are just the same. Like at some point, one of the guests of the podcast said, like, this just sounds like Twitter. Like this just sounds like,
that's
some
what
people.
I was thinking.
Exactly. This just sounds like people are ranting on Twitter.
I know, we have a joke in our house that we feel like people wake up in the morning and go, I have this idea. No one's ever thought of it before. And they tweet it. And they put it out, and it's like literally, not only has it been, it's like cliche, like it's not only has it been thought of before, it's just like deeply cliche, like it's, and goes back 2,000 years.
Absolutely. All right.
And whatever. I mean, that happens. Ideas are in the ether and people get aware about them. And this isn't to pull shade on those people understanding something for the first time. It's that they tweet about it. That's funny to me.
No, absolutely. And I mean, there is in an alternative timeline where Twitter isn't where it currently is. We would have just seen all of these as opportunities. And I mean, honestly, at some point it was that, and I do think it became toxic at some point down the line, like 6-7 years ago. But there was a moment, I still remember the golden age of when it was generally fine to just say something and someone is gonna respond to you, which is what Mastodon is right now for me. Someone
Mhm.
will respond to you like just nicely. Like even if you said
Mhm.
something that might be potentially ignorant or whatnot, someone will kind of call you in, or instead of calling
Mhm.
you out, like hold you accountable if it is wrong or whatnot. But there is kind of a learning curve that's kind of inbuilt to that, which I quite appreciate.
Mhm.
Which is I do feel it's kind of linked to what we were talking about in general, because now we are talking about youth autonomy, let's say before the internet, is probably very different than what it looks like with the internet. The
Mhm.
principle is the same, of course, but the way it can be achieved is fascinating. Like I'm part of me is like this inner child is excited about what the internet can be for kids now, right? Like in terms of
Mhm.
just, again, with all of the caveats of, like, of course you can learn so much on YouTube, but it's still YouTube, it's still owned by Google, and all of the caveats that can come with this. In theory, you can, for example, just spend your entire days watching crash course history or crash course whatnot, and then go on some
Totally.
documentary or go on some lectures and go on. The potential is quite. As someone who as I said, I was born in '91, and I I lived a small period of my childhood, or half of my childhood, roughly, I think, before the internet, or at least before
Mhm.
the internet became everywhere, kind of thing. There was
Mhm.
no smartphone, that sort of thing. So it was still the time when you had to literally connect to the internet, and you had to decide whether someone had to use the phone or,
Yep.
or or connect to the internet. So that's my childhood. But when you did connect to the internet, then there was kind of this opening up of my world, and in many ways I'm a child of the internet. I'm very
Yeah,
much
for sure.
a
Yeah.
kid who grew up on the internet, much more, at least as importantly, as I would describe myself as someone who grew up in Lebanon. That's easily
Right.
understood. But if I say, well,
Mhm.
actually, where are you from? Well, I'm from the internet. That sounds weird, right? and but
Absolutely.
it
Yeah.
is that. It is something. It's something I'm still. Yeah. I guess I'm still grappling with, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always been like, I really love doing analog projects and work and having a physical space and a place where people can come together and learn together. I mean, there was this whole movement about a decade ago called edu punks. And they always figured I would be part of that scene that's like, learning everything becoming digitized and on the
Mm-hmm.
internet.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, no, people still need to like learn together and be
Yeah. Yeah.
together
Yeah.
and have
Yeah. Yeah.
relationships. And also, I agree with you. Like, I'm not a anti the internet. I'm not a big fan of Web 2.0. Like I
Yeah.
have a real
Yeah.
hard time with because of capitalism. I think
Mm-hmm.
that it
Mm-hmm.
had potential. I think the Gen Xers and the younger boomers who were creating these early on in the 80s, these community spaces for people to come together really had a good idea.
Yeah.
And I think it was really important. It was very much used for the left early on. It's how we like could work in solidarity across distances, and it really helped. We know it helped the
Mm-hmm.
movements
Mm-hmm.
and the struggles and the connectivity, but we know in all media studies will tell you that Web 2.0 hasn't helped.
Yes.
It's caused more friction and more problems
Oh, I
than
completely
it's done
agree.
good.
Completely agree. And
But
yeah, sorry.
yeah, both my kids like yeah, the connecting across the world has been vital, and I'm the same. Like this is why I'm not anti-technology. Like I'm, with my stuff and learning disabilities and that, and then also being really shy and an introvert. Like I wouldn't be doing anything I'm doing today without email.
Same here.
Yeah, all that
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Like I just
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have, or maybe eventually, but it would have taken a while.
No, no, absolutely. As I said, like
Yeah.
I didn't know I was autistic growing up. It's something I discovered much later,
Hmm.
and there's no comparison of, on the one hand, my mom being very understanding in the fact that she saw her son as someone who had a thing for books, and so there was kind of an unlimited budget, I mean, to some extent, when it came to books. And so that's something that definitely helped me a lot. But also when the internet, I remember this very distinctly, and something I'm still very grateful for, that I think she genuinely tried to that respect, because Lebanon's internet is pretty notorious for being very slow,
Hmm.
and to this day, like, it's still one of the worst in the world. And at one point, we had one of the fastest internet connections, which is still relatively slow by Switzerland standard where I currently live, but it was like much faster than other parts of my neighborhood and whatnot. And that's just because she paid the higher premium fee, whatnot, because she saw how much I needed it, basically.
Right.
And she saw me just spending most of my time on Wikipedia or those sort of websites.
Yeah.
So in any case, this is sort of like I never know how to end conversations, and this is why I always ask folks, my guests, hey, can you recommend 3 books, because I don't know what to say now. So like, I don't know if you have any kind of general reflections, feel free to share whatever you want to share.
Sure.
And of course, talk about some of the projects that you're also doing, like that sort of thing. And we can get into the book section after that.
Oh, like, okay.
If you want.
Yeah, no, thank you. This conversation has been really fun and generative. And yeah, I'm not on I'm not on Web 2.0 anymore. But you can find me over at listeninghousemedia.com is the website, but Instagram is at listeninghousemedia. We do a little press of pamphlets, bringing pamphlets back, and do other audio and visual work there. And then I'm in part of a collaborative called Grounded Futures. That's on Twitter and all the other, just at Grounded Futures. And we have podcasts and different media projects. I do a show with my teen called Grounded Futures Show. Yeah, and then Trust Kids you can get at AK Press. And my other books and work you can find through groundedfutures.com. I think it's all there.
I'll mention those in the show notes for folks listening.
Trust kids, listen to kids, they know, but also show up in solidarity, and it's not up to them to save the world. We actually have all the power. We should be breaking down these walls, these social borders between us, and working together. That's my final message.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I do have 3 books.
Please, yeah.
So I was thinking, because I'm really interested in multi-generational and intergenerational ways of coming together. So I kind of picked 3 books that, well, I mean, it depends on your kid, how young you go. But otherwise, I would say all ages. The first one is the Earthsea series from Ursula K. Le Guin. Since the onset of Harry Potter, I always suggested to kids, if you really wanted to read a book about a wizard who's where it's creating a better world and a different world, not replicating all the horrors, please read Earthsea. Thank you, Ursula. Ursula is at the core of all my work, so just a shout out to her. The second one is Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. It's Miyazaki's first film, but it was also his first manga. It's 4 books. The movie kind of crosses all 4, but I really recommend getting the manga. It's beautiful. I mean, any Miyazaki is gonna shows to me youth autonomy in a really deep, profound way. A Whisper of the Heart, especially, like, it's just beautiful. And then the other series is also it's also a show now, and has been for a while, but I recommend the manga, is the Mushishi book series. With my speech impediment, I'm not going to try to say her name, but we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, those are my 3.
Perfect. I mean, I was this close to wearing my Totoro hoodie. I have one.
There you go.
But it was too hot in this room. But yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm learning. I told you that we was chatting last week. I'm learning Japanese, and one of the many reasons is just Miyazaki's movies. I was obsessed with Spirited Away and Mononoke. I don't know how many times I watched those. And then I really got into Kiki's Delivery Service, which was then, I think, still is my favorite movie.
I love it.
But Whisper of the Heart is fantastic. Nausicaa is beautiful. I haven't actually read the mangas. I should do so.
So good.
Earthsea, I haven't read it either yet. My wife has. She loves it.
Okay.
I will at one point.
And Miyazaki's son made the
yeah,
film.
Miyazaki.
It's okay. Read the books.
No, I was told the exact same thing. All right, Carla, thanks a lot for this. This was honestly super fun. As I said, to the extent I'm gonna remember most of the references, I will mention them I will put them in the show notes, and I will obviously send you the link when it is out. Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah, thanks so much. And let me know if there's anything I can. I'm gonna. Oh, let's say goodbye then.
Yeah, one second.
Thanks so much for having me on. This was a lovely conversation.
Thank you. The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.